So we're here to talk through this Pentopia by Prasanna. It really is a case for this puzzle style where just being meticulous around the clues is pretty important. I'll use dots here to indicate cells that can't be used, but the first step in any Pentopia is sometimes just going around each of the clues and directions where its arrow points. Its nearest spot can be immediately adjacent, but in any clued cell, the cells right off of the arrow have to be unused. If they were shaded, the arrow would also be pointing into those cells. This isn't really a difficult logical step, but it sets up a good starting point for the whole grid. And having marked those in, you'll see not only that the symmetry of the clues leads to a kind of similar pattern in a lot of parts of the grid, but it makes the center a clear highlight. There are 4 arrows that point together to this 2x2 box, but a 2x2 box is too small for a pentomino. And so you got a situation where I have 4 arrows that have to have at least 3 blank cells before a shade, which means in all other directions they have to have at least 4 unshaded cells. And so we can just go around each of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, up here, 1, 2, 3, 4 for this arrow, 1, 2, 3, 4 in this direction up to 4, in this direction up to 4, coming off this arrow. You need to use this, shade over to here, shade up to there. Off this arrow, at least this is off to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That gets us going. We now have 4 shoots off of these arrows, which are somewhat isolated in their total amount of space. And there needs to be at least a shaded cell in these directions. And so in the case of this, where there are 4 potential cells to use, but if I shaded even this closest one, I'm certainly using the 4th cell and using the first one coming over here. That in those situations, I can do markings such as that. In other situations, I can do markings such as that. What's interesting off of these center shoots is when you come into this adjacent column, you now are placing a shaded cell which is affecting this nearby clue. This shaded cell is 4 away from here, which means that in the direction it points, we can only have a maximum of 3. And so as an early starting step, once you get this pointing down, we can affect and do this. If we look at this clue has to have cells coming to the 2nd row. It must use at least this 4th in this row. Coming down, use this. Knowing that there's only 1 more to take, it has to come back and take these 2. So this will be an L or an N, and I guess we can write that in the margin if it's useful. But in the same way, filling in this cell affected this arrow, filling in this cell affects this arrow. This has 4 away from a shaded in the non-arrow direction, so it must have a shaded no more than 3 away. And we get pretty quickly that we formed an L. We'll mark this around so those aren't usable. That means that this is an N and not an L. And we'll mark some of these cells as unusable. That makes a whole set of space unusable. This arrow is good. We've put in some cells which are near exact arrows, so let's see those effects. For instance, this arrow points up and it has a shaded cell 2 away, so now it needs an arrow. Sorry, a shaded cell right at the arrow. This one has shaded cells 2 away. It needs to have something shaded here. And this is where we can do a little bit of indirect logic, but there is no way this shaded cell is part of this pentomino. There's also no way the kind of tightest shape that this pentomino can make would still leave this cell to be shaded, but you couldn't ever shade this pentomino over further. In all situations, if this is the closest you can get, 1, 2, 3, I need to take 4 and 5, and so these 2 must be shaded. Once I mark that, this arrow now has to have a very closely shaded cell. This can't extend and connect over to this, so these have to be separate pentominos, and we'll use that pretty soon, but for now we're going to have to go elsewhere in the grid. We'd marked these 4 as shaded. We hadn't yet used the fact that we have an L up top to say this has to be exactly an I. We have a shaded cell 1 blank away from an arrow, so this must be at the arrow. Looks good. We've got 6 total cells to shade. We shade these 2 which are forced. We could form an L if we left that unused. An L's already in the grid. So this is going to take that cell and be a Y or a P. We have some shape up here, which we'll come back to. We have some shade down here. We've not looked yet at this vertical column. We have an I in the grid, so if this cell were taken, that would use the I We have an L in the grid. If this cell were shaded, it would follow through and form an L. So we get a situation where at least 5 cells coming down can't be used, which means in other directions as many as 6 cells can't be used. 6 with a shade means 5 with a shade is required down below. That forces a specific shape of a V. And this arrow is true in this current state. And this may be a good time to mark off things we have already assigned. So we're going to need to do some careful tracking to get through the puzzle towards the end. So we now have, having marked this arrow, sort of our intrigue pushed to this arrow just above. This arrow has as many as 6 cells before its first shaded opportunity and has no more cells it can take, so it has to use this cell. Comes over like so. This is left with an L or Z. We've got an L in the grid already, and a lot of these deductions are about not having another L. We've now marked off enough cells that there's only the room for a P over here. And we said before how this was a P or a Y. We just put in the P, so this is a Y. We get to this state, and let's just do some more checking of our arrows. This is 6 to a shaded, so for this to be complete, we can't have any within 7 to the shaded, so that leaves like this. This arrow is complete, but it needs to mark these off, and that now means none of the spaces are pentominoes. And this arrow is good and constrained. This arrow is constrained. This is fine, this is fine. We've got this little set of 6 cells to fill in with something because this arrow points towards it. It's going to have to take this cell and extend to this cell. If it doesn't use this cell here, it's forming another P, which is no good. If it doesn't use this cell up top in the middle, form a Z, which we already have, so it has to take this cell as well, and this has a W or F as its final state. We just put in a cell here, which is going to force a shaded cell here. And this is where I think the progress is meant to happen up top, but there's a general trait about the pentomino set, which is always useful to keep in mind. A lot of the pentominoes have, the concept we'll describe as a bounding box. So there is a 1 by 5, which is the longest and thinnest pentomino by far. There are then a set of pentominoes that fit within a 2 by 4 bounding box. L and Y require to be 2 by 4, and U and P can fit within that box. They actually have a smaller box, which is a 2 by 3, which is their use case. And then the remaining 5 pentominoes all fit in a 3 by 3. And so you often get to a place in the puzzle where you have mostly 3 by 3 shapes, and maybe you haven't placed the X yet. That's the common thing to be left out. You haven't placed the W or F, which sometimes are hard to discriminate. But the concept of 3 wide or 3 tall is a thing that's often true, except in some unusual pentominoes. In this case, we only have a U left. And you'll see if we're shading a cell like this, for you to get 3 tall, you have to reach all the way over here, which is far too far away. So whatever we know that this is a U, and knowing it's a U, it can't take this position. This is no good. A U is going to have this shape with 2 on the right fully shaded. And if we remember that this has a shaded cell 2 away, this nearest cell has to be shaded for this to work. And so we place the U. Now, we had the logic at the top about being too tall and that being okay or necessary. On the bottom, we have to think about it this another way, but this shaded cell has to allow and actually must reach now 3 tall. All the pentominoes left look like this. And in reaching 3 tall, it also has to be 3 wide, and so being 3 wide, it can't take these cells. Being 3 tall, it has to take these cells. It has to take this cell. It's not coming over to here. Using this would be a Z. We're in a situation where this can be an F or a T, but what we've now done is specifically shade this cell near this arrow, which makes this shaded. That is an F. This then can't be an F. This is a T. And so we get this puzzle solved. 10 of the 12 pentominoes are used in the puzzle, and it has this clean theme and real good use of the center cells and the long extended center direction rows and columns to get going. But hopefully some sense of how you should be meticulous around Pentopia puzzles, certainly always checking arrows and what's nearby, and recognizing the ways that the packing of pentomino shapes work in general in all pentomino type puzzles. The thins that are 1 by 5, the 2 by 4s, the 3 by 3s, but then these unique 2 by 3s, often the unique 2 by 3s are where your crucial deductions will happen at the end. That was what drove the logic up here, and in a converse way, the logic down here where we need to use this cell to get a 3 tall pentomino. So hope you learned something about pentomino puzzles in general. Hope you enjoyed this walkthrough, and we'll see you again soon.